Have you or any of your favourite content creators ever been smeared as far right? Woo! For taking a fairly banal and sensible political position, like don't lock me in my home for 2 years, or maybe we shouldn't be racist to white people on behalf of slavery and historical atrocities that they didn't commit. You know, that really kooky stuff, really ridiculous. Have you ever been confused or offended by the fact that you've been smeared as far right when it couldn't be further from the truth about your principles? Well, good news is the insult is so worn thin because they've overused it and applied it to people like Russell Brand, where it obviously doesn't apply, that we can just laugh it off and dismiss it now. Here's why far right is just a baseless smear, and we can disregard it quite happily. Let's start off with Bloomberg here. So this is just a good example. Recently, I don't know if you've been too aware, Stelios, but we've been doing lots on 15-minute cities.
Yes.
And the 15-minute cities is apparently conspiracy theory according to outlets like The Guardian, and now Bloomberg. What 15-Minute Cities actually is, and you can look at all the websites from the Clinton Foundation and the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is an initiative to keep you within a 15-minute radius of your home and make it so that cities have all you would ever possibly need within that radius. And it's to reduce carbon emissions. The problem with that is they're going to tie penalties to your ability to leave with traffic recognition cameras, facial recognition cameras, and they will lower your social credit score should they pass things like a digital ID or a carbon credit tracker limit, which people like the Green Party have proposed. So it's a totalitarian imposition on your freedom of movement.
It sounds like ideal for people who are bored of living.
Yes, well, it's people that are happy to be confined to a pod and sedated by material pleasures, but don't have any curiosity, and that's not really the human spirit. I mean, we're generally quite intrepid as a population, but people who are obsessed with controlling things on spreadsheets don't want us to move too far outside our home because it has all those inconveniences like litter or pollution or road use or resource use, and so they think they can just control you so it looks all nice and good on their bar graphs.
Or people.
Yeah, well, you are the carbon they want to reduce. And so they end up saying things like this, which is the far-right protesters in the UK claim that a local traffic control plan is part of a global authoritarian plot. What the heck is going on? Well, one of the cities that's been targeted by protests over the 15-Minute Cities initiative is Oxford. And Oxfordshire Council have been putting in traffic bollards and flower boxes like Sadiq Khan has in London, and people have showed up fairly recently to go down there and protest this. And this is a video, if we go to the next, by the Oxford councillors. And if you notice the things that they say, they're not just standing there like it's some kind of hostage video where they're being shown a piece of paper with the gun pointed behind them saying, say this or else. But everything they say sounds like received wisdom. They are tired platitudes. It's very scripted and very inauthentic. So let's listen to how they dismiss your concerns about being locked in your home by their technocratic interventions. If we could play this clip, please.
Hello everyone. Recently, we've seen a lot of misinformation about traffic filters circulating online. This misinformation is being spread by many disreputable sources, and it has been extremely disappointing to see it being picked up by the national media outlets as well. These conspiracy theories are causing real-world harm and need to stop. We have been receiving many calls and emails from worried residents in genuine fear that they might be locked in their own homes. This is categorically untrue, and we're talking you today to explain the truth. To reassure residents and set the record straight, we want to be absolutely clear. We are not planning a climate lockdown or a lockdown of any kind.
The traffic filters will be installed as a trial on 6 roads in Oxford in 2024. They will not be physical barriers. They're not steel walls or electronic gates. They're simply traffic cameras that can read number plates.
Okay, so there are physical barriers because there are literal bollards in some roads to stop you from going down these low-traffic neighbourhoods to the point of where the fire department and the ambulance service have complained and people have literally picked them up and removed them and thrown them in bins. But the gaslighting there is astronomical because they use the phrases which have just been, again, tired old buzzwords. 4 uses there of misinformation, conspiracy theorist, and real-world harm. All things that the WEF types are obsessed with legislating against. What does misinformation mean? Who are conspiracy theorists? People who say things we don't like because it gets in the way of our agenda. It's just disingenuous.
It is, and I think that it is very difficult, dangerous that after the COVID lockdowns, many people have been accustomed to it, to lockdowns, and this sends a really bad message to people in governments who may see this as an opportunity to restrict further liberties, or as a sign that people are okay with their liberties being restricted furthermore.
One of the UN's economic advisors, who also works for the World Economic Forum, Manira Mirza, penned a op-ed which said we should reappropriate lockdown measures to reduce carbon emissions. And so what we see there is the government has forced through a policy that nobody asked for. It then becomes the norm, the expected thing to do, because it scaremongers enough people into complying with it, as we'll see that they did later when we go through one of Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages. And then you, as a person who is opposed to this, who raises fair objections to the policy, the efficacy, or the morality of it, are marginalised as a conspiracy theorist, a spreader of misinformation, or a far-right harm spreader. And it's just a buzzword to enact repressive tolerance on you, to label you as an other, and then to get the renter mobs like Stand Up for Racism or any of the various lobbyists who act as left-wing organisations like Momentum to go and bash you in the street and discredit you online. It's just a dog whistle.
This reminds me of 1984 and the use of language there. I'm not saying that we live in such a society. I don't want to be misunderstood, but the practice resembles such a practice progressively more. And the idea of corrupting language to such an extent that terms lose their meaning because there is a chaos, a linguistic chaos that is caused by how carelessly words are being used is very dangerous. And again, it sends the wrong message to the wrong people.
And I think people are fortunately wising up to this linguistic chaos, because you can only move around in the fog so long until that you stumble into something, and people feel like lockdown was stumbling into something, a policy they weren't asked about. A similar policy they weren't asked about was Sadiq Khan's expansion of the ULEZ zone to all of the London area, because in the consultation period, everyone was overwhelmingly against it, and he pushed it anyway because he got orders from on high, from whichever think tank or place in Davos he would quite like a job in after he's voted out as mayor or has his terms up, that says we need to reduce carbon emissions, so again, restrict freedom of movement, inconvenience people out of driving through London. And this was a people's forum where Sadiq Khan presented the ULEZ and the plan to roll it out to a group of London constituents. He decided to marginalise all of them as far-right. He conflates a bunch of different groups together, and they're not too happy about it. So let's listen to the people's displeasure, please.
There are objections in 2006 when we banned smoking from public places, and there are objections now. What I find unacceptable, though, is some of those who've got legitimate objections joining hands with some of those outside who are part of a far-right group who are... Some of those outside, some of those, let's be frank, let's call a spade a spade. Some of those outside are part of the far right, some are COVID deniers, some are vaccine deniers, and some are Tories.
Look, hang on. The mayor has a right to be heard, right? Don't look. This people's question time is an opportunity for you to have an exchange of views, not to heckle or shout, please. Otherwise, we could end this very, very quickly.
Now, to those people who've got legitimate concerns. By the way, and in fact, some of you have got good reasons to oppose ULEZ, but you're in coalition with COVID deniers. You're in coalition. You may not like it. 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 You're in coalition with the far right, and you're in coalition with vaccine deniers as well.
So I am very glad that the crowd decided to boo that, because the nakedness of the far-right label being a smear is on pure display, because he lumps them in with COVID deniers, vaccine deniers, obviously trying to invoke the ludicrousness of Holocaust denial when COVID and vaccines exist. So it's not like they're saying that they don't exist, they just have questions which cannot be voiced on YouTube. And also Tories. Now, I know Sadiq Khan's head has disappeared up his rectum because he's so left-wing, but I don't have a principal complaint of the Conservative Party being too conservative. If anything, it's quite the opposite, as we've covered timelessly. And I think that's why the British public now are not voting for them in droves. A large amount of people that voted for Boris Johnson won't vote Conservative in the next election because they didn't get what they were promised and because they were socially conservative. And so it just embarrasses the far-right smear as being unable to be defined, but here's a bunch of groups I don't like, and so I'm just going to hit them with this label.
But he does this because he wants to blackmail the population. And he wants to say the percentage of people that support the Tory party, however large it is at the moment, you are going to be labeled as far-right if you are not going to buy into the entirety of the agenda that he's putting forward. And the alternative is if you are labeled as far-right, you will be you will be marginalized, you will lose your job, and you will be, let's say, castigated from society.
Exactly. It's the underlying threat of the same of Marcuse's repressive tolerance, which is violence, which is we will permit all movements which move us further to the left and repress all movements which move us anywhere closer to the right, or traditionalism, or the conservation of your civilization, anything that isn't socialism and communism. So it's a naked political power play. And when you say the perspectives that they're trying to marginalise, that they're trying to say are not sensible, if you go over to our website and read this article by Carl, our wonderful founder, the Sensible Centre, you will see the kind of perspectives that they argue are far right are being against mass immigration on economic grounds. For example, you can't keep up with the population increase of a city the size of Liverpool moving into the UK every year and build houses and ensure there's enough money for healthcare and things like that. Pro-Brexit, so pro-personal sovereignty not being governed by a European superstate, a German Fourth Reich, if it will. Not a big fan of the mid-century Germans, not a big fan of the 21st century Germans at this point. And being anti-lockdown, so don't imprison us in our home, and even pro-death penalty. And there's even discord within this office here, which they're going to label far-right, over whether or not the death penalty is legitimate. I know Josh is more sceptical, and I'm tepidly more pro. So, as Carl goes through the statistics for each of these issues, that's most of the population. Now, I know, as more philosophically minded types, we don't crowdsource the legitimacy of our opinions with how many people agree with us. Again, the same with, as they're going to bring up the mid-century Germans for the far right, lots of people voted for Moustache Man, so the crowd isn't always right, etc. But when they're trying to isolate you and say that you are a fringe and we are the majority, it is useful to look at some of the aggregate polling, not just from one place like YouGov, which is very corrupt, to see, do the majority of the population share my concerns, or am I truly a vanguard on the fringe? And when the majority of the population agree with the perspectives shared in this office, that they'll label as far right, of the protesters opposing the ULEZ zone, then it's hard to marginalise them, and it just shows the smear is meaningless.
Even if someone disagreed with Brexit, it's an incredibly dangerous thing to say that the majority of the population that voted for it is far right.
Yes.
And in conjunction with what we said before about Sadiq Khan and the reason why he smears supporters of the Tory party, this shows that he doesn't care about what the majority thinks. He wants to marginalize the majority. So that majority is going to become a minority.
Absolutely. And he's got his orders on high, and carrying those out secures him a job at the end of his term. So all of this rhetoric is purely self-serving.
Yes, exactly. And I think that it is also self-serving, and one of the features that contribute to the linguistic chaos is that right now we should also talk about another divide, not just the left and right. We should also talk about the globalist and the non-globalist divide.
Absolutely.
We live in a very different world than the world we lived before 3 decades in. So this divide is something that maybe could not have been predicted. I mean, the gravity of it could not have been predicted 3 decades ago, but we need to wake up into the new world and understand where we live in. And this is something that we want to put forward, and I am willing to, I don't think it's a wild guess, but I bet Sadiq Khan is against non-globalism.
Well, no, he is a globalist.
I mean, he just said it.
He's an out-and-out globalist.
Yeah.
I mean, when he was pushing through the legitimacy of the ULEZ, he used a chart from the World Economic Forum.
Of course. Yeah.
So what we want, I think the fulcrum of modern political debate is, there is technology that we must contend with. We're moving inexorably towards things like AI and automation and 3D printing and all sorts of abundance that can distance us from nature and rapidly accelerate our technological evolution past the point of natural human evolution for what our bodies are suited to. So which way do we go? Do we go to further technological centralization, like China with the social credit score, or do we go to devolution, self-governing little communities with their own energy supplies, the ability to trade independently, instant communication, things like that? I'd very much like to be on over the side where different people can live in different satellite states and feel a sense of community, and Sadiq Khan is more on the central control side because it'll earn him money eventually. And so that's why he's smearing you as far right. If you want to live on your own with a nice little community, with a house that you own, with a family and children, and don't want to be told where you can and can't go, then you're apparently far right. And it's ridiculous.
And I must say that it is a very pernicious theme with particular politicians. One of the things that I try to see when I evaluate the character or when I make assessments about a politician's character is how much humanity they have, which of course it can be faked. But there is an issue there because there are some politicians who completely dive themselves into abstractions. They view things from a purely managerial perspective, and you see that they cannot enter into ordinary human relations. Most ordinary human relations are relations of partiality, such as the communal relations you mentioned before. In a community, people know each other more than they usually do in the cities, where, for instance, you may not know your neighbor or you may avoid them in the corridor. So this is a kind of pretension at an impartiality and an impartial perspective that you could say is a bit of hubristic, and is not close to a immediate relation to human beings.
Yeah, because he has to manufacture compassion in order to win over the undecided voter. But because he's in the Westminster bubble or the Davos bubble, he is so disconnected from the people his policies will impact that he can't actually care about them. And so he doesn't care.
And that is why, for him and people of this persuasion, they are not thinking of a human person who is locked into their home, whose liberties are being restricted, who live in cities where, for instance, their communities disintegrate and a healthy sentiment of national identity is lost.
Yeah.
They just see numbers, whether it comes in terms of carbon emissions or whether it comes in terms of economic, they just see numbers.
Yeah, and you're an inconvenience on their roadmap to utopia. So, again, trying to embarrass the far-right smear as it truly is meaningless, let's go to Joe Rogan's recent episode with Russell Brand, where Joe and Russell, and I don't know if we'll have to cut any of Russell's clips for YouTube, because YouTube are very censorious, but if we do have to cut them, go over to our website linked in the description or our Rumble channel to view those for full context. But Joe and Russell discuss how during the pandemic, because they endorsed equestrian-related interventions, that they were smeared as far right, and they properly articulate how silly this is. If we play the clip, please.
That wild shit that they did cost them their credibility. I just don't think they understood the landscape when they were doing that.
I don't think they do at all. I think they took an extreme editorial perspective without realising that's what they were doing. And I think that the entire mainstream culture has actually found itself on a kind of a peninsula, that where there is insignificant variety, in my view, between the two parties, which is why they're so willing to remain engaged in cultural war discourse and the conventional hot button topics in this country in particular around the pro-life, pro-choice and guns arguments. They're willing to remain in that territory because financially and economically they are ultimately aligned, that the most powerful interests in America are happy with either outcome. I think that what's happened in the media space is they've unwittingly found themselves in a place where there's a kind of that incompetence was afforded, that they're not used to being challenged, that the assumption was that you would be sunk by that narrative, that it was an insignificant new space. And obviously it was a massive miscalculation because they weren't watching what was happening. They weren't listening to the conversations with McCulloch and Malone and Weinstein, and that it is apolitical, and that also that in order to make themselves seem distinct from one another, they have amplified their small differences to the point where they don't recognise actually that isn't America anymore. That people like that, even when I was a kid, if someone was just like right wing, that's just like, oh, that's a right wing person. Like you've been your family around your table. I read something about Tucker Carlson the other day. yesterday, like, you know, because of the release of those January the 6th documents to Fox and to Tucker in particular. And it said, far-right journalist Tucker Carlson. If Tucker Carlson's not far-right, he's like a normal right-wing guy. Far-right means marching and red, white and
I've
black
seen
flags.
me written as far-right.
Far-right.
They've
That's like
described me as far-right.
tattoos on the face,
Yeah.
extreme boots. You know, like far right's not just like, oh, I believe in Christianity and like, stuff like that.
So I quite like that quite effectively, just because number one, Brand and his long and storied career of being a former drug addict who is openly left-wing, who has even befriended Yanis Varoufakis, one of your favourite politicians, who, for those who...
He's not, sorry.
No, for those who don't know, not just did he screw up Greece, but he also authored the intro to the 2018 Penguin edition of the Communist Manifesto. So Brand, I disagree with him on plenty. I find him very entertaining. But the point he makes is very astute, is that they marginalise him as far right because they have minute differences in CNN and MSNBC and somewhere like Fox, because they might focus on the particular colour of politician they vote for, Republican or Democrat, but what they actually agree on is endless Ukraine funding, endless subsidies for the big pharmaceutical companies, the military-industrial complex. They agree on modern monetary theory. They agree on a trickle-up form of wealth creation towards their biggest donors. They are capitulating to corporate interests. And so they try to stigmatize you as far-right with the image of like American History X, just to dismiss all your concerns no matter which political background you come from.
I want to say two things here. One is really short. I want to say that if I did not misheard, I won't say I disagree with him on a small point. I don't think that having your country's flag and protesting or marching with your country's flag makes you far right.
No.
So,
but I don't believe he said that. I believe that he's saying that the media stigmatize as that.
Okay. But back to this. I think it's ridiculous to call Russell Brand far right, a person who belongs to the far right. It's completely ridiculous, especially if you have watched him more than a minute.
Absolutely. And so we're going to watch him for more than a minute because he also went on Bill Maher on the same week with an MSNBC journalist. And again, this clip probably won't be able to be shown on YouTube, so go and watch it on our website. He eviscerates the corporate press narrative, and the crowd, just like with Sadiq Khan, are cheering for it. Very interesting to see how thin the smear has grown. Let's play.
John, I've not known you long, but I love you already. But I have to say that it's disingenuous to claim that the biases that are exhibited on Fox News are any different from the biases exhibited on MSNBC. It's difficult to suggest that these corporations operate as anything other than mouthpieces for their affiliate owners in BlackRock and Vanguard. And unless we start to embrace, and also, mate, like just spiritually, if I may use that word in your great country, we have to take responsibility for our own perspective. I've been on that MSNBC, mate. It was propagandist nutcrackery on there. I went on a show called Morning Joe. It was absurd the way they carried on.
Good Morning Joe.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know what it was. It wasn't morning. There was no one called Joe there. No one could concentrate. They didn't understand the basic tenets of journalism. No one was willing to stick up for genuine American heroes like Edward Snowden. No one was willing to talk about Julian Assange and what he's suffered trying to bring real journalism to the American people. And I think to sit within the castle of MSNBC throwing rocks at Fox News is ludicrous.
My friend,
Make MSNBC better. Make MSNBC great again.
My friend, I would, the moment...
Fight them on a territory you can win on, John.
Russell, darling, the moment that you give me a specific example, an actual example...
Okay, I'll give you one.
Just wait.
Wait.
Just
I thought you needed a specific example.
How about a specific... Let me tell you what the specific example I'd like to hear of. I'd like to hear a specific example, a provable specific example of an MSNBC correspondent or anchor being on television, saying something they knew was false, and we're saying behind the scenes to people, I'm about to go out, and we know that the election wasn't stolen,
You've
or something
illustrated this
equivalent.
example.
But I will go out on television and say the opposite. I will lie.
When's my answer?
Just give me the specific example.
I understand the basic point.
Give me a specific example.
All right.
I'm with you. I think it's a false equivalency, Russell. It's
not. That's your own bias.
It's not about bias. It's a false equivalency because you don't actually know anything about any of these organizations you're talking about, even on MSNBC once. Big fucking deal.
My darling, it was more than enough.
You can't come up
It
with
was such a
that.
carry-on.
You have a single actual fact.
Do you want an example? Do you want an example?
Yes.
The ludicrous, outrageous criticisms of Joe Rogan around deliberately referring to it as a horse medicine when they know it's an effective medicine.
Yeah, that's not a bad
Rachel
example.
Maddow turning up on the TV saying if you take this vaccine you're not going to get it when it hadn't been clinically trialled for transmission.
Non-responsive.
You have to listen.
Wait.
Do you think you
Not
can
a
improve
response.
America
I
by
think we could all
determinedly
be
and
better.
avowedly condemning Fox News without acknowledging that you're participating in the same game? Did you not just listen to Bernie Sanders, someone who plainly, legitimately believes in this country and believes it's possible to change, but is bound by corruption, is bound by the lobbying system? Surely it's clear to you, Bill, as one of the great pundits and experts and comic voices, that systemic change is required. Money has to be taken out of politics. We need new political systems that genuinely represent ordinary Americans so that we can overcome cultural differences. And bickering about which propagandist network is the worst is not going to save a single American life, not improve the life of a single American child, not going to improve America's standing in the world, and the world needs a strong America. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that. So you have an obligation, a duty, not to condemn these people.
Other than assuming that Bernie Sanders has the best interests of Americans at heart, I don't disagree with anything he said there. And he is coming at it from an avowedly left-wing perspective, so to marginalise him as far-right is madness. And I think he missed a trick, actually. He didn't need to focus on criticisms of MSNBC for unspecified medical intervention that we can't mention on YouTube. Instead, he could have just said something like Rachel Maddow knew the Russia hoax was complete nonsense. They said Carl Rittenhouse was a notorious mass murderer when he obviously wasn't. Joy Reid has said numerous racial untruths and even said that critical race theory had nothing to do with Marxism in front of Kimberly Crenshaw, and Kimberly Crenshaw embarrassed her on her own network because Kimberly Crenshaw was saying, no, all critical race theorists are avowedly Marxists. So these are easy wins that embarrass the mainstream networks as a uniparty from even a left-wing perspective. So he's not far-right.
I think we can explain why he's called far-right in the following way. In every society there is a structure or a social order. And very frequently that social order is unjust. People who want to disrupt it are, let's say, are assaulted, whether just by words or by physical force. Some may be far-right, but it is not necessarily the majority. Russell Brand is doing the same thing. He's not far-right, but he is denounced as being far-right. And I want to ask you, how many times have you heard the accusation against someone of being far-left? We do hear it, but if we compare how much we listen to the accusation far-right and how much we listen to the accusation of someone being far left from the people who are parts of the establishment and from politicians, we will see, I think, that most politicians think that they are gonna use the word far right more liberally, and curiously, no one defines it anymore.
Yeah, and also because, well, one, if you try to define it, it dispels, like Freddy Krueger being told he's nothing, the obvious mental image that comes to your mind first, which is mid-century Germans. Again, another word we can't say on YouTube for some censorious reason. But it's curious, again, the embarrassment of the far-right label is that most of the politicians they define as far-right, like Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, who are in the pocket of the World Economic Forum, who are globalists and not localists, who are not conservatives, themselves don't really use the term far-left all that much. So it is just repressive tolerance. It's just playing whack-a-mole with any dissent to their preordained plan. And so I'd just like to scroll down again for some more evidence from the fact that it can come from a left-wing perspective and that this is a divide and conquer agenda. This tweet thread here, which goes through graphs of how many times terms like systemic racism, transphobia, homophobia, intersectionality, unconscious bias were in headlines prior to Occupy Wall Street. So prior to 2008, when a bunch of leftists decided to go out and complain about the military-industrial complex and big pharmaceutical and all of the hedge funds which are now pushing ESGs, the left were pretty much unified and on a similar page to some of the Tea Partiers in saying, well, we've bailed out all of the people that caused a crash. We shouldn't be doing this. We need to look at the money system here. We need to look at the Fed. We need to look at the IMF and Bank of International Settlements. And suddenly, all of the corporate press started talking about racism. and sexism, and they decided to divide the left up with intersectionality and fragment it into identity interest groups that are constantly infighting in order to tear down the civilization they exist in. So it's all astroturfing, just like far right, just like racist, bigot, and all of these other labels which have gotten so boring. It's just to propagandize you and distract you from having actual criticisms of the establishment.
And the problem is that when people become desensitized to this, they cannot easily distinguish between the actual far right and those who are merely labeled as being far right.
Exactly. And so the consequences of this psyop, let's wrap up on Matt Hancock. This is some consequences biting this man in the backside. Now, this is a leaked WhatsApp as part of the Telegraph lockdown files, which Callum went through last week, and I may go through in depth at some point at Hangout. And during a time when COVID was falling out of the headlines, Matt Hancock asked one of his advisors, when do we deploy the new variant? So, before the lethality of various COVID variants had been determined, Sage, the behavioural scientist sitting on that committee, and Health Secretary Matt Hancock had decided that it would be expedient to use it to scaremonger the public into compliance with COVID lockdown restrictions. That is not questioning the lethality of COVID, more so it is just saying, YouTube, that the politicians were willing to use it when convenient to make you follow their arbitrary laws. And we have this because journalist Isabel Oakeshott, who I was on Piers Morgan with back in October, so she decided to hound him for that, leaked all the text because she was meant to be writing his book. If we go to the next one, please, John. This was a masterclass in not accepting the framing. I know. So what you're saying is, Stelios, so what you're saying is...
I'll leave, and when the video finishes, I'll be back.
So Kathy Newman on Times Radio, now from Channel 4, decided to interview Isabel Oakeshott about the fact that she leaked the WhatsApps. Isabel Oakeshott discontinued the interview when Kathy Newman disingenuously went after her salary, when Kathy Newman is paid plenty as a mouthpiece of the establishment. This is a masterclass into how to deal with these people. You rip away the curtain, you break the fourth wall, and you show the audience that it is not about the story for them. It's just they're trying to smear your reputation because you're getting in the way of accountability for and the aims of the establishment. Let's play this clip, please.
What matters is the content of these messages and what they reveal about the mistakes that were made and the attitude and the power-hungry nature of the way we were being governed behind the scenes. I honestly just think a preoccupation with who's saying what about me or so on. It's not about me.
But no. But I mean, you have hit the headlines, and this slot is about you because you're the one who's in the headlines. And there was a bit of a shouting match, I hear, with Harry Cole, political editor of The Sun. I just wonder whether you understand why he was exasperated, given that you're paid a reported £250,000 a year by Talk TV. Hang on. Now producers and reporters on a fraction of your salary were having to kind of put up with your sloppy seconds and follow up the story in a rival newspaper. It's a bit galling, isn't it?
I'm just not going to go down this route, Kathy. People don't know the details of my work contracts. I'm just not going to go there. I just don't think that this is of interest to people. I think people are much more interested in what the investigation reveals. Most of our listeners won't know the individuals that you're referring to. I think it's kind of absurd that you should be quoting wild figures about my contract with any news organisation. That's my business. It's not yours.
But I'm just interested why you decided to go with the Telegraph when you do work for Talk TV, and that's in a media organisation with other newspapers.
If your focus is on this angle, I will terminate the interview now because this is not what I've come on here to talk about.
Well, I'm talking about you hitting the headlines, and this is part of the story. But I mean, let's talk about
my work arrangements are not part of the story. Actually, they're actually absolutely nothing to do with it.
So you have no qualms about taking this story to the Telegraph. You're happy with how that went.
I'm going to terminate the interview. Okay,
well,
this is my last warning. Okay, I'm going to terminate the interview. I've not come on here to justify where the story was placed or how I chose to go about that. I've come on here to talk about the story and the fact that you have started wheeling out inaccurate figures about my contract or any working arrangement I have had. I think that is frankly unprofessional.
Well, we're talking about your story that has hit the headlines.
No, you're not. You're talking about my salary. That's what you've been talking about.
Well, no, I'm not talking about your
What's that
salary
got to do
anymore.
with you?
I'm not
What
talking
has
about your
that got to
salary.
do with you? Do you want to talk about your salary?
I
How
want
much
to talk
you
about
paid?
the story that has played out this week. I
How
wonder
much
if you're.
you paid,
Are you?
Kathy?
I haven't hit the headlines. You've hit the headlines, Isabel.
Well, maybe if you broke some stories, you would.
Well, I've broken a couple of stories this week since you mentioned it, but
what were
don't worry
they?
about that.
What were they?
I'm not going to go into that because I haven't hit that. This is not me being
Unfortunately, I haven't
interviewed
heard of
on
them.
this stuff. Right. What I want to ask you, Isabel, is here we are that you've ripped up an NDA to dump Matt Hancock in it. You dumped Vicky Price in it. Wait, let me finish. She ended up going to prison on the back of correspondence with you about speeding points. Well, Isabel Oakeshott, I'm afraid, has terminated that interview, but we will now. I would have liked to know the answer to that question, but perhaps she'll come back on and tell us, or maybe she'll tell another news organisation. Perhaps she'll answer that series of questions on her Talk TV show. I would like to hear the answer to that.
Okay, so I just want to chime in also from a little bit of Talk TV experience there, and we'll get onto this last thing before we wrap up, so I don't go over too much time. But for those who don't know, both Times Radio and Talk TV are in the same building, News UK. Sometimes they're on the same floor. So Kathy Newman's point about it's a rival station, how could you go to... okay, mouthpiece of the establishment, you work for the same conglomerate. Don't be ridiculous. But Oakeshott immediately went there, okay, you're distracting. You're not talking about the story. You're not talking about accountability for the lockdown that you supported too. Instead, you're just trying to smear my character and detract it. So let's finish up and have a good laugh to palate cleanse from Kathy Newman with the kinds of people that are instead representing the establishment, because the man who is to be Matt Hancock's lawyer, suing Isabel Oakeshott for breaching her NDA, for being in the public interest, that we see the lockdown text for the next 3 months, by the way, that's how they're going to be rolled out, went on GB News. And he complained that GB News identified him as Matt Hancock's lawyer. And Steve Allen, again, a man of the left here, self-identified left-winger, handles this very well because he smears GB News as a far-right outlet and gets his comeuppance. So we can learn from this. These people are embarrassments. Just repeat their own words back to them and the smears dissipate into thin air.
Code, who was actually recently asked to act for Matt Hancock. Thank you for joining me.
Yes, I have to say that's disappointing because I made it absolutely clear to your programme. I asked them not to disclose that. And that is very, very poor journalism.
Okay, well, it seems like, are you okay to carry on, or is that the kind of thing that means you don't want to carry on?
No,
I'm going to apologise for having that in the...
I can't go around because I disagree with what a lot of you say, but you've stood there in front of a baying audience throwing poo left, right and centre at Matt Hancock when your own television station has engaged in correspondence with me where I explained that I'm in a position to be able to comment on this and mentioned that I'd been approached by Matt Hancock. I asked you not to mention that.
Well, I apologise that we've...
Anybody's tempted to take you seriously or your programme seriously, here's a good reason not to.
In this moment, I can apologise for including that information, and I just need to know, you are, of course, and I would love to know your counters to any points that I made. Yeah, we're not specifically talking about this. I've just been given the actual email that you sent to my producer, which they'd like me to read out. As a courtesy to the lady who approached me to act for Matt Hancock, I would be grateful if it was mentioned that he asked me to act for him. So it seems that you actually...
You're absolutely right that it's my mistake. I missed out the knot. I take all of that back. My abject apologies. You're right and I'm wrong. No, fair dues. I'm absolutely wrong about that. My apologies.
I think we will leave it there, but thank you very much for partaking in that conversation. Best wishes. Jonathan Code, thank you very much for joining us.
Bear in mind, that idiot went on for about 7 minutes complaining about how this entire station's far-right and to be discredited. So I think the lesson we can learn from all this is that far-right means nothing.
He was an automatic pilot.
Yep, pretty much. His NPC programming kicked in and suddenly there was a bug. Because far-right means nothing, you can just repeat the hollowness of their words back to them, embarrass them on live and public air, and eventually they'll have to find a new smear to hit you with. But until then, we're not far-right, we're just sort of sensible, really.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the Epoch series, this one on historical financial crises. you'd like to find out what else Lotus Eaters is putting out, you can follow on Getter at LotusEaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.